me just get a quick comment, if I may, on that important period you referred to, transition, that movement from care into the broader world. And there's a recommendation in the issues paper about raising the age to make it older before a child leaves care. So I'll ask you to comment on that. But if I could also, in talking to young people in preparation for our May forum, there was a lot of talk about the need for mental health support, the prevention of suicide, concerns about sexual safety, fear of assault, to be blunt, sexual assault, rape, difficulties with housing, problems with poverty and homelessness. It did sound like that transition period is still a really dangerous period for a young person. So again, in a nutshell, what are you doing in Victoria around the age when people need to go out of care, and what support you give them to transit into being responsible for themselves?
Yeah, look, I've been at the centre nearly 9 years. When I got there, kids were being exited from care as young as 16 with no support at all. In Victoria, last year, the Victorian government committed to extending the age of care to 21 and to fund all children with the care and support package they need till 21. So that includes rental support, education support and a range of other supports, financial supports for children until 21. They can also stay in foster care if they wanted to, or if they're in residential care and moving out of residential care, then rental support and other supports for those children. It's been a game changer in Victoria. I would hazard a guess that the numbers of children leaving care into homelessness will drop dramatically. And you're monitoring that, so you'll have data? That'll be monitored over the next sort of 1, 2 and 3 years. I don't think it's quite hit people outside of our sector, the magnitude of the change that's going to occur. But for children themselves who weren't beneficiaries of this, who left care before this was implemented, they say to us, this would have made all the difference to me. I have had to struggle and I didn't need to. It's probably been, for ministers involved, one of the most significant things they've ever done in their ministerial lives, and they've said that. And, it's astonishing that it's taken this long, but now we have it. I would say to all states and territories, if you want to make a real difference to children's lives, make sure, if we take them into care when they're 3 or 4, are we seriously saying they're grown up and ready to be an adult at 18? My kids weren't. And so we're pretty proud of that in Victoria. I know it isn't everywhere, but I would say to states, it's not expensive. It really matters to these kids. The kids want it. Make it happen.
I'm going to come to sustainable funding frameworks in a moment, because you've mentioned there about cost, but I just want to come first of all to what's happening in Victoria in relation to your working partnership with First Nations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander agencies and communities, because you've done big things over many years. Just alert us to, if you would, in a list format, the key things, and I'll get references where I can refer people if they'd like to learn more about the nub of what you're doing in Victoria.
Yeah. Look, I suppose our view and the view of Aboriginal leadership is that Aboriginal children need to be supported and cared for by Aboriginal communities. So over the period of the last 5 years, we've seen some very big changes. My organisation wrote a seminal document called Beyond Good Intentions. The spirit of that document was that non-Aboriginal organisations needed to hand over resources and decision-making to Aboriginal-controlled organisations to make decisions around their communities. Legislation was enacted in Parliament that allowed Aboriginal-controlled organisations to do the work of child protection. They're the ones that are the guardians for Aboriginal children here in Victoria. They make the decisions about removal, but also children returning home. Enormous numbers of children, Aboriginal children, who were in care have gone home as a consequence of those policy changes. We've also got lots of work going on around specific Aboriginal practice and the evidence about what works with Aboriginal children and families. From our perspective, where we need to go now is to make sure that Aboriginal-controlled organisations have a suite of funding so that they can intervene a lot earlier for Aboriginal children in care.
In the issues paper in South Australia, there's a segment on support for Aboriginal self-determination and family advocacy, and it refers to the Family Matters approach in South Australia. But I guess hearing you there, that notion of Aboriginal self-determination, is that underpinning the spirit of what's happening in Victoria? Or how do you express it?
It certainly does. But at the end of the day, Aboriginal controlled organisations need to have the resources to work with their community. And for far too long, those resources were put through or handed to non-Aboriginal organisations to hand on to Aboriginal people. It's not good enough, and we don't do that in Victoria. Dedicated resources are provided to Aboriginal controlled organisations to do the work that needs to be done with their own communities. And so, yes, indeed, all of this is guided by self-determination. But what we say as non-Aboriginal people is give Aboriginal communities the resources to do the work they've wanted to do for a very long time, and we have not provided those resources directly. So fairly significant, they would say, we still need more resources go directly to Aboriginal controlled organisations to do the brilliant work that they do. And so I think there's been a cultural change in Victoria is what I'm saying. It's about, we're behind them 150% in terms of doing the work that needs to be done, that we failed at. I mean, it's not our work to do.
I was involved as an MC of child protection conferences in Victoria over 20 years ago. So I remember the days before what you've just described. So again, just in a nutshell, what achieved that change? What's your analysis of what made it happen?
I think that my Aboriginal colleagues were working behind the scenes for many years to develop the solutions. They did what I described earlier around what we call Aboriginal guardianship, which is to hand over to them the decision-making for children who are in care and under child protection orders. They'd gone to Canada and a range of other jurisdictions to find out what might work in Victoria. So they had it ready to go. And they were ready to go for years. Then a couple of things happened. The state government created a new role, an Aboriginal Children's Commissioner. So the inaugural commissioner was Andrew Jacamos, and he undertook a seminal piece of work called Task Force 1000. He looked at every Aboriginal child, he looked at their files, and he interrogated those that were participating and had decision-making around these children and discovered a range of shocking scenarios, things that were not happening for these children. And in many ways, that work, our policy position around self-determination and Aboriginal controlled delivery of services sort of created the groundswell, but particularly Andrew Jackamos's work created the groundswell for the changes that we have now. And it is exciting, Julie, that we see such promise in the lives of Aboriginal communities to take control of some very significant social problems that some Aboriginal people are facing. And it's wonderful to see their work.